Hello Violets, welcome back to another video. This is going to be the fourth time I'm recording this because every time I try to talk about the power overload keystone, which is our topic of conversation today, the video gets longer and longer, and that's because I keep adding more and more information to it. And finally I decided, you know what, if this video is going to be 40 minutes long of me talking about a single keystone, then so be it, because I really want to move on. So this is going to be our topic of conversation, power overload. Now, the Skitari has been out for some time now. Is it over a month or something like that? And most of the build crafting you see tends to center around the redline capacitor keystone or the flensing protocol. And there's a very good reason why you would use these two, because the benefits are great and the impact tangible. That leaves power overload often in the dust without very much conversation about it. So today, I thought it would be nice to dedicate an entire video really deep diving into what this keystone offers for your build, some strategies and synergies with it, as well as talking about its rather strategic location in this part of the Skitari's cog talent tree. So let's get it on. Now, let's start with the basics first to get everyone on the same page. Power overload. Kills by you and allies in coherency grant 1 stack of power overload. Elite and specialist enemy kills grant 2 stacks, max 30 stacks. Once you've reached max stacks, you will cause an overload to happen around you and it resets the stacks down to 0. Whenever you have an overload, you will give yourself and allies in coherency plus 15% damage and 15% toughness damage reduction, or TDR, for the next 8 seconds. So, this, just from reading on it, if you have never used it before, sounds like the Zealot's Blazing Piety keystone as well, where its trigger condition is going to be getting kills around you, whether it's from yourself or from your allies. And so, to get this keystone working is very easy. Just be nearby when you or allies kill things and that's it. So, activation condition, simple. This also means that the power overload keystone scales with difficulty in a way, because the higher up in difficulty you go, the more enemies there are, the easier and more frequent you're going to trigger this power overload. So, that's something to keep note of. Now, as for the actual benefit itself, the plus 15% damage and 15% toughness damage reduction are good stats to have. That's the same as having, say, Channeled Motive Force, which also gives you plus 15% damage, and something like, let's say, Progressive Plating Matrix, which also gives you plus 15% toughness damage reduction. So you can think of this power overload as giving you the benefit of 2 talents every 30 kills or so for 8 seconds. So that's how you can read it. This is kind of like a 2-in-1 combo that happens every now and then. And when you look at it that way, it's not bad. But let's move on to probably the meat of this video in one sense, and that is going to be static capacitor drain. This is a talent that is almost always going to be picked up whenever you use power overload because the benefits it gives you are very significant. So every time you trigger an overload from power overload itself, you will build up stacks. And when you reach a certain amount of stacks, you will get a particular benefit from static capacitor drain. Once you overload 8 times, you get an additional 15% damage. Overload 16 times, and that gives you another 20% toughness damage reduction. And finally, when you overload 24 times, you will increase your capacitance generation by plus 25%. So, obviously, the capacitance generation thing is going to be a very big topic because it recently got fixed in the latest patch. But let's talk about the first 2 stats first, the plus 15% damage and 20% toughness damage reduction. So, those 2 benefits are actually pretty good. But if you look at it from the same lens where we saw power overload, you can see that this is basically giving you the value of 2 more talents from your tree stuffed into a singular node. So if this was Channeled Motive Force and Progressive Plating Matrix, then the benefits from static capacitor drain would be, let's say, Mobian Conductor and Threat Detection Imperative as well, because this also gives 20% toughness damage reduction, and this is also another 15% damage. So now, with these 2 talent nodes together, and once you've built enough stacks for static capacitor drain, you have the value of 4 different talent nodes in your Skitari tree shoved into these 2. And that, in a sense, makes these 2 nodes on the power overload keystone a very efficient pair of nodes to have, because the amount of value you get just from these 2 nodes alone is incredible. On top of that, once you consider how impactful now that plus 25% capacitance generation is, this becomes a very, no pun intended, powerful keystone to have. The only reason why it's not talked about as much is because the benefits are not as directly tangible or impactful, but from a numerical sense, it is very impactful. So, before we talk about capacitance generation, I need to establish the baseline first. If you have nothing on your Skitari, right, you have none of the talent points active, your Skitari has 2 ways of generating capacitance. You can do it passively, which means you generate 2% capacitance per second, or you can do it actively by killing things. If you kill a poxwalker or any lesser enemy, that will give you 2%. If you kill an elite or special, that will give you 4%. So that's the base way you're going to regenerate capacitance. Now, initially, before the latest patch, this node, as well as the capacitance generation from redline capacitors, was actually bugged in that this capacitance generation only affected the base 2% per second from your base regeneration. That meant you would move from 2% to 2.5%, right? So because 25% of 2% is 0.5. Now, if I said it that way, it sounds really, really like sad because, right, you're just getting a 25% on 2%, that's like 2.5%. That's like nothing, isn't it? But when you break down the numbers themselves, that is actually much more substantial. And anyone who even wrote this off in the bug state where it only affects base regeneration probably underestimated how impactful it was going to be. And this is because of how capacitance generation interacts with the your combat ability cooldown. So the way I describe this, if I had to explain this to someone who has not played Dark Tide at all, is that your capacitance generation is like water, and your combat ability is like a jar that you need to fill to get an ability. So if I use that same analogy, you need to fill your combat ability jar for 50 seconds in order to get one charge, because 2% per second will reach 100% in 50 seconds, right? So that's very straightforward. You need to wait 50 seconds at base to fill one combat ability charge. Now that we know that, how big of an impact is increasing your base capacitance rate from 2% to 2.5? So you can look at this 25% increase to your base capacitance rate as the same as reducing up to 10 seconds of your base cooldown. So that means you go from 50 seconds cooldown to 40-second cooldown. Now, I don't know about you, but just dropping your base cooldown by 10 whole seconds is pretty substantial, mathematically speaking, right? And if you don't think that's too much, allow me to introduce you to combat ability regeneration on your Curios. This does not affect your regeneration rate. What combat ability regeneration does for the Skitari is that it reduces the size of the jar that you need to fill. So at base, you need a 50-second jar to fill. If you have 3 combat ability regen Curios, the size of the jar drops from 50 seconds to 44 seconds. That means if you're running your water at 2% per second, you will need 44 seconds worth of your water. And if you compare how much 3 combat ability regeneration Curios gives you relative to just the improvement to your base capacitance generation, 6 seconds shaved off from 3 Curios versus 10 seconds from just having this node alone is a no-brainer. That 10 seconds is worth 3 Curio slots. And I think you can do a lot more with your Curio perks if you just have this node alone. The same kind of applies to redline capacitor, but this is technically less unless you pick up resource optimization, but we'll save that for later. So that is the base impact. So even when static capacitor drain was bugged to only affect your base regeneration, that was the impact already. It shaved off 10 seconds of your base combat ability cooldown. That was pretty impactful in my book. Now, it has been fixed so that this 25% affects all of your Skitari's regeneration capabilities. And that means augmented power cycle is affected, capacitor reclamation loop is affected, flux conduit buildup is affected, reactor recall charge is affected, and satiated steel is also affected because this is also capacitance regeneration. This is something probably most people don't think about. How impactful is this? The answer is quite substantial. Just now, I did the math for you to show you how impactful just adding 0.5% to your base 2% was. That shaved off 10%. Now, if you add 1% more on top of that, it is going to be a very, very big number. But just to set you back to the base, right? So if we have nothing but the base capacitance generation, and then we add 1 more percent on that, our base regen is now 3%. That 1 more percent that we just added shaved down our cooldown from 50 seconds down to 33 seconds. That is a 17-second cooldown reduction from just this node alone. So if you combine it with static capacitor's 25%, you will have a base regen rate of 3.75 seconds. 3.75% per second. That translates to shaving your combat ability cooldown by, I think it was 24 seconds, right? So 24 seconds from 50 seconds gives you like 26.6 something. That's where the math is. But effectively, you're almost cutting your cooldown in half just with this node alone. And that is really good. Now, the other thing I have to mention, I have to go back to the combat ability regen Curios, is that the more regeneration that you have built into your kit, so in this case, let's take, I have combat augmented power cycle, I have 24 stacks of static capacitor drain, and my base, right? So that gives me the 3.75% capacitance regeneration. that actually makes these Curios, the combat ability regeneration Curio, worse. And I can prove this to you mathematically. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some numbers on screen here so you don't get lost. At base, if you have all 3 combat ability regeneration Curios, this drops the size of the jar that you need to fill from 50 seconds to 44 seconds, right? And if you have no modifiers to your capacitance generation, you will need to wait exactly 44 seconds to get your cooldown back. But if you pick up the augmented power cycle, your regeneration rate is now 3%. With the same 3% capacitance generation trying to fill the 50-second jar, so that's the base cooldown jar, you would need 33.3 seconds, right? So that's roughly the 17-second cooldown that I mentioned. But if you are trying to fill the 44-second jar, that means you have all 3 combat ability regeneration Curios, you would need 29.3 seconds. So the value difference between having all 3 Curios is now only 4 seconds. That actually gets worse when you include static capacitor drain, because with this and with the augmented power cycle, your capacitance generation rate is now 3.75 seconds. And so the difference is that if you are trying to fill the base jar of 50 seconds with this setup, you now need to wait 26.6 seconds. But if you had 3 combat ability regeneration Curios, you would fill that jar in 23.4 seconds. That means the 3 combat ability Curios you have here is really only saving you 3 seconds worth of time. Now, I won't tell you whether or not 3 seconds is worth it because that can be subjective. So you might argue that 3 seconds is a long time, but I would argue that I can wait 3 seconds longer to substitute this out for something more useful. Because I don't think shaving off 1 second cooldown per slot on my Curios is worth it. But I suggest you defer to your own judgment to tell yourself whether or not it's worth it. I'm just providing you the numbers. However, I will say that the more regeneration you get, so for example, if I also pick up reactor recall recharge, or if I pick up flux conduit buildup, this is a passive one as well, the cooldown Curios get worse and worse and worse because you're regenerating so much more capacitance that the fact that your jar is smaller doesn't really matter anymore. So that's something to take into consideration when you are playing with power overload, about how impactful it makes your build when it comes to regenerating combat ability charges. And that the more sources of capacitance generation that you have, the worse combat ability regeneration on your Curios becomes. So if you had hypothetically something like this, where you're picking up literally everything, there's really no point using combat ability regeneration anymore. You would probably get your cooldown back for your Cord Claw in a single swipe and then wait for like 15 seconds. You get the charge back just as fast because this is going to become from 25% to 31% with static capacitor drain up. So as long as you kill a single enemy with your Cord Claw and you have static capacitor drain at 24 stacks, and that's not even counting you waiting for augmented power cycle, or getting a headshot with reactor recall recharge, or scoring a crit with flux conduit buildup, which your Cord Claw will do because it's a guaranteed crit, and hitting multiple enemies at the same time. That is the impact of stacking together all your capacitance generation with static capacitor drain. Okay, so I think I've talked enough about this one singular node, so you can see why this video kept getting bigger and bigger because of how much I wanted to explain the impact of this node alone. Now, let's move on to the other supporting keystones. Next one is going to be Invigorating Overload. Now, this one, you could argue, is the quote-unquote weakest benefit of the entire keystone. And that's because toughness restoration in of itself isn't bad, but it's also one of the most abundant resources that every class has access to. The Skitari has plenty of overtime regeneration, like auto repair doctrines, superior defense engrams. If you're taking ACD, you got restoration protocol. This is overtime. This is overtime. So Skitari's got plenty of overtime toughness regeneration. So in a sense, the fact that this restores a burst of 20% is actually a little better than it would otherwise be. So the toughness restoration, not the best, but also not the worst. The stamina regeneration, however, I find is much more valuable, and that's because this helps you circumvent a problem in a way. And that is, if you are dodging a lot, your stamina regeneration is paused, and it's paused for 0.85 seconds at base, unless you are playing Hivescum with some of the nodes. This allows you to bypass that because the burst stamina will still trigger even when you're dodging. And if you're playing a very twitchy melee playstyle like I do, then having that stamina regen helps you a lot, especially if you're using something like the Arc Maul or a Crusher or anything that relies on push attacks a lot, then that stamina will come in clutch. And it has made a tangible difference to my Havoc games and my Auric games as well. But whether or not it's worth the entire node is still, I'm still exploring whether I want to keep it. Most of the time, I don't use it, and I definitely feel okay, but there are some circumstances where I wish I had more stamina. But yeah, that's my opinion on this node here and my thoughts about its value that it brings. Aside from static capacitor drain, this node right here, critical power overload, is probably one of the greatest value nodes that the Skitarii kit has in its entirety. And that's because this thing does a lot of work if you look at the wider synergy for the build. So let's read what it does. The overload now applies an electrocution effect to enemies in melee range, causing enemies hit to also take 15% more damage for 8 seconds. Now, there are 3 things to note here that isn't very clearly mentioned, I would say. First is going to be the application of electrocution effect. So this is an innate synergy, and what this does is that it basically works like a miniature version of voltaic emitter, but triggers every time you get overload. So it's dependent on how fast enemies are dying around you. But the fact that it applies an electrocution effect means it has innate synergy with system shock, which would then apply 10% brittleness as well, and retribution conduit, because all enemies that are electrocuted will also be subjected to the increased damage dealt to them by this node. This also can trigger weakness analysis doctrine because it is an electrocution effect, so this is nice to have as well. But this means that you can use a weapon that isn't capable of applying electrocution on its own and still benefit from these 3 nodes somehow, right? I know there's this node here which is it gives you electrocution effect to the first target hit on a critical hit, but if you're using a weapon that doesn't have very high crit, like the Mechanicus Power Sword, for example, it only has a base 7.5%, then you are really unlikely to trigger this at all, which means you can't take advantage of these 2 nodes. This lets you very frequently take advantage of both of these nodes for weapons, especially that cannot crit very well. And this means it opens up build variety with your weapons and more synergy within your kit, which I always appreciate because that means build crafting is more diverse. The other thing that I need to mention here is the word melee range. Now, when I say melee range, you might think something like this. This is like melee range, right? But in reality, melee range isn't exactly that. In fact, it is kind of much further. So I'm gonna set up a test here to show you what exactly melee range is. So give me a moment. Okay, I am now back. So I have built up some stacks of power overload and I'm now 1 hit away from triggering it. I've also set up a whole bunch of rages over here to show you what melee range looks like. So I'm going to kill 1 Poxwalker and it's going to trigger the overload to show you where the range is. So you can see that this rager here is affected. This is 7 meters, but actually it can reach up to 8 meters, so that range is a bit too far. This is what melee range is considered, which means you have a 16 meter diameter to trigger a critical overload, which will then apply electrocution to every round around it, which will also trigger system shock, and also apply the damage debuff onto all enemies around. So melee range is not 2.5 meters in this case, it is in fact 8 meters. So that increases the value of that node alone because it means you can debuff a whole bunch of enemies in a one go. Now, the last thing I need to talk about for this node is also probably the most, I would say, interesting one, apart from the math from static capacitor drain. That was very fun to do. And that's the 15% damage debuff. This debuff is a unique debuff. It is specifically written as critical power overload debuff, which means it stacks with other debuffs multiplicatively. And that is a huge deal when it comes to mathematical calculations. This means that this debuff stacks multiplicatively with the Artificer Servo Skull's debuff. So if I hit an elite, you'll see that the Servo Skull debuff appears, right? That debuff is 15% damage as well. That 15% is not 15 plus 15 with this node. It's 15 times 15. So what that basically means in math is that instead of getting 30% damage, it actually increases your damage by 32.5. Now, that extra percentage might not make a difference when you're doing base math like this, but when you start adding a whole bunch of other damage modifiers, finesse damage, strength, brittleness, other forms of ADM, that the way that's calculated becomes a huge deal, and that matters for bursting down monsters and bosses. So this is why I really like this node a lot, because of the way it interacts with other debuffs. So if you have at least a build, if you have a build with at least this node and the Servo Skull, you can, in most circumstances, because this is still triggered based on power overload, apply a 32% debuff to a monster or an elite or a boss or the twins or whatever. And 32% is not too far from the vet's, what's it called again? Focus target keystone, right? Base focus target applies 20%. If you have the max stacks, it pushes you to 30%. So having both a power overload and the Artificer Servo Skull debuff on an enemy basically gives you the same as a 6-stack version of the Veteran's Focus Target debuff. And to me, that's kind of cool. That's a very cool interaction that you can kind of pair together and actually do some work. So that's what I think about the Critical Power Overload keystone. I think that this is a really powerful keystone to have in your build if you can swing it, because it opens up more synergy with the rest of your kit. And that brings me to the last item on the keystone list here, and that is Powerdrive. Now, the value of Powerdrive really depends on how you are building the rest of your kit and what you intend Power Overload to do. So, for example, if you are just doing the bare bones Power Overload where you just really want static capacitor drain for all the benefits, which is fine as well, then I do not think Powerdrive is worth it. Because one of the reasons why you'll get this is that once you hit the 24 stacks, it doesn't really matter anymore. You're getting so much benefits that triggering the occasional 15% damage and TDR is a nice bonus, but not critical. And plus, 8 seconds is plenty of time for you to re-trigger the power overload buff again. Which means getting power drive kind of loses its value once you get static capacitor drain. It will help you get this faster, but after that, it doesn't matter. And I think from my experience, even on Auric level difficulty, you can get this up in about 5 to 6 minutes if you are if you're fighting like at least Auric high shock, because this is very dependent on your ability to fight hordes, and the more enemies you have, the faster you build it up. On the other hand, if you are using power overload with critical power overload keystone here, then I think power drive becomes a mandatory talent to take. And that's because this gives you some semblance of control to be able to trigger the debuff from critical power overload, which can make or break a fight. Let me do a demonstration for you. Okay, now I'm back with the example. Say, for example, I've built up 27 stacks of power overload and I've only got 2 more enemies to kill. Oh no, now I'm stuck at 29 stacks. If only there was another ad for me to kill to trigger power overload. If I didn't have power drive, there will be 0 chance of me triggering it in this combat situation where there are no enemies for me to actually kill. Right? And that happens sometimes in Havoc difficulties where you're being run off by the twins especially, and there are no ads nearby, or someone else is dealing with the ads and you're isolated from your team. With Power Drive, you can trigger your combat ability to actually force critical power overload to trigger. And if you have your Servo Skull active as well, when it's applying damage, you can now stack both the debuffs for that sweet 32.5% damage. And that can make the difference in your combat situation. Now, something else that just happened there, if you were keen of eye, you would have noticed. I'm going to zoom into my stacks that happened just now and see if you notice something. Did you pick it up? No? Yes? Well, let's go read what Power Drive says. Gain 5 stacks for each charge spent. So just now, I triggered Voltaic Emitter with 3 stacks. So that means I would have generated 15 stacks. But notice how many stacks I have now. I only have 1. That's because Power Drive does not overflow the stacks from a single ability use. So in other words, if you have 29 stacks and you have banked 15 stacks from Voltaic Emitter, you will still only generate 1 stack, because the moment you trigger the power overload, it resets to 0 and does not count any more stacks from Power Drive. And so that's something which I thought was kind of a disadvantage if you're using Voltaic Emitter, because you can't control how many stacks you're using. You always use the maximum number, which is either 1, 2, or 3. Where something like Cord Claw at least is more manageable, because you can always like drip feed 5 stacks if you need it here, 5 stacks if you need it there. And it generally allows you to build up your stacks faster because you aren't consuming all your charges in one go. So that's something I observed when I was playing around with power overload, and something to take note of as well. So yeah, that in essence is everything you need to know about the power overload keystone as a whole, right? There's some synergy we talked about system shock, retribution conduit, and weakness analysis doctrine. We talked about synergy between the Servo Skull debuff and critical power overload. The final synergy I want to talk about is where this keystone is located. This is something which I feel isn't really appreciated a lot, especially when it comes to build crafting. Most everyone just talks about, yes, let me just reset. Everyone just wants to let's beeline straight to redline capacitor and pick up more stacks, more charges, more rending, and then so we have more charges on our cord claw, etc., etc. Or we can go all the way down to flensing protocol, right? Obviously you won't do this. You'll probably do something more like that. And pick up the all-important critical chance and melee attack speed node here. And of course, we're going to pick this up and increase it to 12%. Now, this is all fine. It works for a reason because it's very effective, right? You can feel the attack speed. You can feel that you have more charges when you look down at your combat ability. But what I find is not appreciated as much is the pathway to power overload. So what I just did here is one of the ways you get to power overload if you're building it directly into the tree. Take a look at this. 15% damage from Mobian Conductor. 15% damage for your next attack for dodging. 15% damage for melee kills or range kills. Basically, this is like the veterans specialist where you just edge out engagement where you're getting damage for your other weapon. But that's basically 15% up all the time. 15% from power overload itself. 15% from static capacitor drain. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 nodes here are giving you damage the entire way to pathing into static capacitor drain. That is 75% damage from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 nodes. 5 of your nodes are giving you damage out of 6. If you think about node economy to how much damage you're getting, this is incredibly efficient. Because even if you just started here, let's say most builds tend to like end at mobile conductor and branch up here. They usually never take these nodes here. Or some builds might actually want to go this way and stop here. The fact that you're getting so much damage for trying to path into static capacitor drain through power overload is actually really good. Because the comparison is this. If you were going down to fencing protocol, you would pick up something like, let's pick up as much damage as we can on the way down, including fencing protocol itself. Here you have, what, 30% damage overall, 45% if you're doing heavy attacks, and 25% extra weak spot damage, which its value depends on your finesse multiplier anyway. So that's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 nodes here, and you get, what, 30% base, 45% conditional, and maybe a bit more weak spot damage. 5 nodes here gives you 75%. So you'll have like a 30% in best case scenario over flensing protocol in terms of raw damage output. Now, of course, flensing gives you more DPS because of servo sinew surge, but this shows you the value of trying to path into the power overload tree because you have a lot of raw damage to offer, and that matters for certain weapons and certain build styles. Now, if you talk about redline capacitor, in terms of damage, it's not that great because really the only damage you're getting is from. Okay, let's put something like this. The real damage you're getting is going to be from channeled motive force if you branch down. 12.5% sequence charge. This one is really hard to control. Even with the servo scout manipulation, it is kind of random. And the redline capacitor base doesn't give you anything in terms of damage. Obviously, it gives you more charges, which is great. But damage-wise, comes from advanced power management, which at most is 25%. So you get 25% here, 12.5% here, and if you do the multiplicative mass of 1.15 times 1.375 is... This at best gives you 58% equivalent damage increase as well as 15% rending, but you have to spend 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 nodes to get that 60% damage. Now, of course, strength is really good because it scales differently from your raw damage, but it's expensive to get this kind of damage pathing into redline capacitor. So I just wanted to show you the relative benefit of going for power overload is that it is very efficient to build up tons of damage with this build. And that's not counting the debuff from critical power overload, which multiplies differently, and the fact that you can synergize with system shock, which allows you to electrocute, apply brittleness, and therefore increase your ADM damage. And since you're already in the neighborhood of this tree, you can also pick up things like Galvanic Marking Array. That's another 20% damage for spending another 2 points here. And if you're going down the range path, you can get access to Rad Sync. Not that it is very useful. This is very useful for only very specific weapons and builds. And you can take Assassination Protocol as well for another 25% against tankier targets. So overall, there's a lot of damage within this tree. Now, if you're wondering, well, so what? There's a lot of raw damage, but I don't need all the nodes. And it depends on your weapon. And that is true. The fact that this path here has a lot of damage, a lot of straight up raw damage, means certain weapons benefit a great deal more. Weapons that have innate strength, like the Mechanicus Power Sword, for example, it has innate 30% strength, benefits greatly from a lot of raw damage power. And if you combine things like superiority, which gives you more strength, well, strength scales better when you have more raw damage, because more strength on strength is basically the same as having more damage on damage. You would ideally like a very good balance of strength and damage. So this is where I feel for certain weapons like the Mechanicus Power Sword, Power Overload might be a very good source of increasing your performance with the weapon. And for a weapon like the Mechanicus Power Sword, which doesn't have very high crit anyway because it's not a crit weapon, part of the Frenzying Protocol's benefit of critical chance maybe not as useful. I'm not saying that it's worthless. It's definitely good having more crit because it's a finesse weapon, but it means that a weapon like the Mechanicus Power Sword has access to a lot more builds than what you might think, and you can do that by accessing the Power Overload keystone. Because in my build theory, the Mechanicus Power Sword has a, shall we say, disadvantage in that it cannot trigger brittleness, and brittleness is one of the components of your increasing your overall damage. Now, normally you would come from Electro Strike, like I mentioned earlier, but it doesn't have crit, which means you can't trigger this very easily, which means it cannot trigger System Shock easily as well. And because it can't electrocute either, it can't really use Retribution Conduit. So there's a lot of damage left on the table for a weapon like the Mechanicus Power Sword because it cannot trigger electrocution. But this keystone kind of solves that. However, until I put it to the test, it would just be a theory, a build theory. Thank you all for listening to my ramble. I'm now looking at my OBS and it's like 44 minutes. I'm not sure how much time I'm going to shave off after editing, but if you listen to it this far, thank you so much. I really appreciate the support and the fact that you enjoy listening to me yap about Darktide. See you all in the next one. Varlets.